So this gospel story is 2,000 years old, but it's still very relevant. It's a story of two brothers fighting over inheritance. I don't know whether you've ever seen this in your family or other people's families, where while the parents are alive, they're working hard to make sure they can pass on something great to their children, and the children get along perfectly fine. But as soon as the will is placed on the table, everything changes. As soon as there's money on offer, something in the human heart becomes a bit twisted. And brothers and sisters who are best friends are now at war with each other. And sadly, this is a story which is repeated in every generation. And I think we see this in different ways as well. You know, an example which I often hear amongst people here, many of the migrant families, you've had great relationships with your family back home, you've moved here, and out of the generosity of your heart, you send money back home, and suddenly things change. People start having expectations, and they start getting angry because this person's getting something and yet they're not. Money changes everything. And this is really why Jesus spends a lot of time talking about money. I don't know whether you actually notice this in the scriptures. A lot of the images, a lot of the parables are really trying to address this part of us which is kind of grasping, holding on to things. We relate to his creation in a very unhealthy way. Years ago, when I was only a few years ordained, I think the gospel must have been something like this. And I decided to preach about the church's vision about money and quoting from a lot of the saints about how we should hold on to these things very differently. And at the end of the Mass, nobody talked to me. Everybody avoided eye contact. It was as though I didn't exist. And I realized that I touched a raw nerve, that this is something we don't want God to be part of. We've worked hard. It's ours. It's mine, my own, my precious. I don't want God coming near that. But this is precisely what Jesus is trying to address. There is something where we become slaves of our own possessions. If you were to try to summarize this really simply, there is nothing wrong with you owning things. The problem is that the things can start to own you. And you come to a place where you're serving them. And maybe you're not even consciously aware of this. But if you think of our modern world where everyone is so frantically busy, a lot of that's because everyone's drowning in debt. And something is flipped where we are no longer enjoying the things, but rather we're now working frantically to feed them or pay off them. It was years ago, I was working with a couple whose marriage was falling apart. And they were getting quite close to the point of divorce. Communication had broken down. There was a lot of bitterness, a lot of resentment. And it was really being driven by a lot of financial stress. And really at the center of this was their house. They had this beautiful house. And they had quite literally built it themselves. The husband was a builder. He had worked tirelessly making this into his beautiful creation. But what this meant was they had an enormous mortgage. And so he was now working 70 hours a week trying to pay this thing off, which meant that they were never at home, they were never talking, everything was falling apart. And in working with them, I got to this point of saying, you might actually have to make a serious decision here. Like you're both working so hard to save the house, but in the process, you might lose your marriage. And as a result, you'll then lose your house as well. So something has to change. We come to that place where the possessions now own us and drive our lives in a place we don't want to go. And this is where Jesus is trying to break through that and bring freedom. He's trying to get us to change our way of thinking in two things. Firstly, by realizing the shortness of your life, and then by recognizing the gift of eternity. If you can hold those two things in your mind every single day, you will not become enslaved by what you own. Because you'll realize that all of it's passing. All of it's going to disappear. The clothes you're wearing will rot. The house you're living in will eventually fall apart. Hopefully not while you're there, but it will. Nothing is going to last. Everything is temporary. The only thing that's eternal is the person sitting next to you. Your family members. They have an immortal soul. They live forever. And so you need to look differently at your life, focusing on what's actually important. There's a great quote, I think it's by Pope Paul VI, where he said that we are meant to love people and use things. But the big problem is that we love things and we use people. And I'm sure you've been on the receiving end of that sometimes, maybe at work, where it seems like the machine or the computer is worth more than you are. You're disposable, but the company's invested a lot of money in this stuff. We do this all the time. And we need to change our whole way of seeing everything. And so if we can realize how fleeting and short life is, as we hear in the gospel, this man who has accumulated so much wealth, and God says, that's great, but tonight you're going to die. And then what? If we can hold on to that, it changes our perspective. There's an image that I sometimes use, if I can use a house key as an example here. Now, I don't own my house, the diocese does, but your house, you've invested a lot of time into that. A lot of your life has gone into paying that off. And so it's not just a building, it's actually 20 years of your existence. When you've got something like that which is so valuable, the temptation is that you want to hold it tightly. You grasp onto that. And you want to make sure no one takes it from you. No one damages it. But the problem is that you then end up living your life like this. And it means that if God comes along with another gift for you, you can't receive it because your fist is already clenched. God could come along with another great opportunity, a very particular calling or vocation on your life. And you can say, sorry, God, I'm busy. I'm too busy holding on to this stuff. I can't go. I can't serve you. I can't follow you. Or maybe it's as simple as your children come looking for some particular help and you say, I've got to go to work. I'm just busy because I'm holding on to this stuff. And as a result, we miss what's truly important. Whereas I think what we need to do is hold on to it loosely. We recognize that we do actually need this stuff. We need things to survive. But we need to realize that it's a gift. I did not create this. It was given to me from God. And maybe you say, well, hang on, no, I worked hard for that house. Yes. But the job was a gift. Someone gave that to you. The intelligence you have, which means you got the job, that was a gift. The health you've got, which meant that you could go to work, that was a gift. All of it is a gift from God. And God places it in your life, and maybe one day God will say, I'm going to take that so I can give you something else. But we need to be in this place of holding loosely so that we can just receive and give. There's a great example of this in the Old Testament, in the book of Job. If you've never read the book of Job, you need to. The basic story is this guy has been amazingly successful. He has got this enormous farm with thousands of sheep and cattle. He's got this amazing family with sons and daughters. He's got this enormous house. And in the space of a day, all of it is destroyed. People come and steal the cattle, kill the sheep. The house falls down while his children are having a party. They all die. It's kind of tragic. It's the opening of the story. And Job stands there in the midst of all this rubble. His wife is furious. She's angry at God. How dare God do this to them? And yet Job is standing there with that open palm. And he simply says, naked I came into this world, and naked I'll return. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. It's this attitude of complete detachment. Now, as the story goes on, God returns great blessings upon him because he continues to have his life open, recognizing that everything is gift. And so I think this is the freedom that Christ wants us to have. That we can really examine our hearts and see the ways that we do become twisted up. You know, we try so desperately to fill our emptiness with stuff rather than filling it with God's love. And Jesus presents that promise that if we can allow ourselves to be truly loved, we can then hold loosely to the things of earth. And we can then allow ourselves to bless other people. This is just the final point to make. If I can go back to that homily when no one spoke to me afterwards. I was quoting a couple of the saints, and I think they speak into this situation very powerfully. You go back to around the 5th or 6th century. Saint Basil was a famous saint who said that basically we need to look differently at the world because of the resurrection. And he says, you know, the shoes that you have in your cupboard that you're not wearing, they belong to the person without shoes. All the clothes that are just going moldy, they belong to the person without clothes. The food you have in your cupboard that's going old, that belongs to the person who's hungry. And he was trying to say, you know, like, the stuff you have is not actually yours. You know, use what you need, but then everything else is meant for someone else. There was another saint, St. Gregory Nazianzen, I think it was, who basically said that if you think of like the treasurer of the country, I have no idea who the Australian treasurer is at the moment, but imagine whoever that is. The treasurer has millions and billions of dollars going through their hands every day. And their job is to just keep passing it on to people wherever they need it. If the treasurer decides to start putting it in their pocket, they're going to get in trouble. It's not theirs. And this is what St. Gregory says. He says, you are like a treasurer of God's gifts. You need to keep what you need for your own survival and that of your family. But beyond that, your job is to distribute to those who are in need. If you have been blessed, your job is to bless those who don't have what you have. And so in a sense, if you are wealthy, if you have had opportunity, you've been given a vocation. You've been given a job to look beyond yourself and be creative to see, how do I use this to lift other people up? And this is so much more than just giving money to people, because once again, that can cause problems. It's about how do you bless people with education, opportunity, employment, finding ways to lift people up. This is where you, as lay people in the world, should be looking outwards and asking God to say, where should I be your hands and your feet passing on this gift that you've given to me. So let's just pray as we come into the Mass that we can really be open to where the Lord is calling us, so that our hearts can be a real gift to those around us.